Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, aka Art Styling Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. Today I'm going to be using this pumpkin and spice stamp set with watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to create a simple card watercoloring this image. I absolutely love this image. I love pumpkin spice, so this is absolutely perfect. The very first thing that I do anytime I have a new clear stamp set is I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It removes any possible manufacturing residue, and it just helps that stamp to take ink a little bit better. This is just a habit I've had, and I always do the entire set, so I know if I've done one image that the entire set is done, or if I've used one image, I know the entire set is done. So I'm going to use that large image, and then I'm also going to use one of the sentiments. This is distressed watercolor cardstock, and I like to use it because it's a nice bright white, so the colors that I'm going to be painting are true to the colors they're supposed to be. I'm using my Misty stamping tool to stamp this image a couple times with Versamark ink. I know you can't see the image on screen, but when you look at it from the side, you can see where that Versamark ink is. The distressed watercolor cardstock has two different sides to it. It has a smoother side and a textured side. I use the smoother side for this because I want as clear an image as possible. And I'm heat embossing this image with some vintage photo distress glaze. I thought it would be a little bit more warm than, say, using black or using something metallic. And I really love the look of this for a fall image. After pouring that embossing powder on there on top of a scrap piece of cardstock, I tap all the excess off, put that back in the jar. That's the great thing about heat embossing is there's very little waste because anything that doesn't stick to that ink gets put right back into the jar. And one thing to note, if you happen to have any grains of that embossing powder stuck to your cardstock anywhere, you do want to use a brush to brush them off before you do your heat embossing. If they're left on that cardstock while you're doing your heat embossing, they're just going to melt into the paper. You're never going to get rid of them. So the colors that I'm going to be using to watercolor with are all from the Distress Watercolor Set 4. I like to use Distress Watercolor crayons because there's very little mess to it. I also like to use Distress refills when I'm watercoloring, but for this particular project, I thought the watercolor crayons were going to be perfect. So the first color I'm using is carved pumpkin. Now I have a water brush here that has water right in the handle, so when it comes to cleaning my brush I can just wipe it on the paper towel to my right, or if I happen to have too much color I can do that. If I have too much water on my brush I can just dry it off on that paper towel. There's very little mess to it, and I tend to be a bit of a klutz, so by having a water brush that has the water right in the handle, I don't have a jar of water on my desk, so I don't have something that I could possibly tip over, and there's a very good chance I would if it was there. For the next color, I'm using Shabby Shutters. This is just a nice green. When you're doing the heat embossing for these images, there's a lot of area on these leaves that are covered with that embossing, so obviously you can't watercolor that. So I'm only watercoloring the leaves that have an open area. Now I do like or prefer to do watercolor with heat embossed images, partly because I like the difference in texture with that heat embossed outline. The other thing is I don't need to wait for an area to dry before I watercolor beside it. So I can watercolor whatever area I want, and that heat embossing adds a little ridge between those areas so that those colors aren't going to run together. The next color that I used there was Festive Berries for some red parts of those fall leaves. When I'm watercoloring with these watercolor crayons, I just pull the color right off the crayon. I don't scribble it anywhere. For the most part, you'll see me scribble it onto my glass surface for a part later on, and I'll explain why I do that then. But when you first do it, you get a lot of water and very little color, so you get a really light pale color. But as you keep using the crayon, that water sinks into the crayon, so you get a lot more pigment. So when I'm coloring an area, I start with that lighter color that's more transparent, color that whole area, and then as I get a darker color from that crayon, I go in and do the shaded areas. And you can see that I use my paper towel often to clean off the excess ink from my brush. If by chance I have an area that's too dark, all I do is clean off my brush, use that clean brush to remove some of the color. And that's the bonus part about doing watercolor, is there's a lot of forgiveness to it when it's still wet. You can add more pigment to that wet area and it starts to blend and bleed all on its own, or you can use that wet area and just pick up the color because it stays on the surface for quite a while. So for the surface below the cup and the pumpkin, I'm using ground espresso. And again, I start when the color is lightest and go over an area, and then I deepen it right below where that pumpkin is, right below the cup. Then I'm using some tea dye for my cup. Now I don't want to add a whole lot of color to it. I want to have some shading around the outside edges, but I want most of the cup to be fairly light. You could always change it. You can add a lot more color if you wanted, but I do prefer when the cup is light so that the details of the flowers and the greenery and the pumpkin, those are the ones that have the most color. So those are the more of the focal points of the card. The next color I'm using is Scattered Straw, and I'm using it for the whipped cream on top of the cup. You could leave this white if you want, but I do think it looks better with a little bit of shading. So most of my color is going to go on the outside of that whipped cream just to add a little bit of visual dimension to it. And then I do keep most of the actual whipped cream the white, or very, very little of that scattered straw. I grabbed that tea dye crayon again and did the rim of the cup because I realized that I had missed that. Now here's where I'm using my surface for a palette. When you're using these crayons, you get a lot of pigment as that water soaks into the crayon. I wasn't going to paint the background of this card, but as I got the image done, it just, to me, needed a bit of a hint of color. If I were to go right on this chipped sapphire crayon, I would get a whole lot of color quite quickly. So by scribbling it onto my glass surface, I can control how much color this is. And again, I only want a hint. I don't want to take any attention away from the cup and the pumpkin and the foliage. I want to just enhance it and just kind of add a bit of a background to it. So by scribbling that crayon on top of my glass surface, I can have just very little pigment there, blend it with the water and get it on that background. And you can see that I'm getting very little color to it. Another option would be to use a lighter blue distress watercolor crayon, but I didn't want to pull in another set. I was really hoping to be able to do this whole image with just one set. And the only blue in this set was this chipped sapphire. And it tends to be fairly dark if you use it right from the crayon, especially after that first little bit of hint of color once that crayon gets wet. So by doing this, I can keep that color light. I can be fairly controlled with it. And it's a great way to get different variations of color from your crayons. If you happen to have a dark color and you want a really light shade of that or light version of that, you can do this trick. And it's hard to color that crayon to the glass, so you're not going to get too much crayon there anyways. So it's a great way to just do a really light version of it. Another area that I forgot to color was the straws or the little sticks coming out of the drink. So I did that with the carved pumpkin. So my image is pretty much done. I had an area there with that background that wasn't quite done, as well as a leaf that I hadn't colored. So I went back in with that light carved pumpkin and then went in with the shabby shutters. Now, one thing that I love doing with watercolor is adding different textures. So one of the ways that I did that was doing that heat embossing. So we have that heat embossed, that glossy texture of those lines. Another way that I like doing it is with different mediums. And one of the mediums that I love to use is interference inks. These, in my opinion, are magic ink pads. They have one look on lighter white cardstock and a completely different look on black or dark cardstock, but you can also watercolor with them. So when you watercolor with them, you're mostly going to see the color that you see on white or light cardstock, especially in this case because I'm using light cardstock, but you're going to get a hint of that interference. Now, you're not going to get as much of the interference shimmer as you do when you are stamping with it or when you are ink blending with it, but you are going to get a little bit of that in those areas where this color is heaviest. So I go over my pumpkins. It was still good that I did my pumpkins ahead of time, so I have all that shading there. I'm just going over it lightly, making sure that there's a little bit of that interference inks in the areas that I want it to be heavier. So when it tilted into the light, I have a little bit of that beautiful shimmer. Now, the other thing that I like to do when I'm using interference inks is use them on my mats. So I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock here that I trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I'm just using that pad to rub around the edges. I only need to do it around the edges because the inside part of my image is going to cover everything in between there or everything in the middle. So this is just going to coordinate with that pumpkin, with that shimmer, and it just adds a little bit of shine to the image as well. My watercolored image here, I trimmed that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and now we're ready to assemble our card. So I have an A2 card base here. I am using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle, and I love using that Barely Art glue because it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. It starts to set fairly quickly and it sticks really, really well. So after gluing my mat down, then I glue my image down. Another way that I like to add just a little bit of texture is with stickles. So I'm using Stardust stickles here. It doesn't have any color to it. It has a little bit of an opalescent shine. So any color underneath it is going to show through, but it's going to just add that little bit of texture and that little bit of sparkle. So I let that dry for probably about 15-20 minutes. I put a little bit on the inside of the flowers as well as that whipped cream, and we have just a gorgeous card with some beautiful shimmer as well as some texture from that embossing. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Have a fantastic day.